Yes, just considering this particular portrait of King Richard III, which incidentally isn't the earliest portrait of King Richard III, and that's important because we can, on observation, notice that earlier renditions, both painting and line drawings, did not depict the king with any deformities. But this particular portrait, attributed to somewhere between 1533 and 1543, on tighter scrutiny, shows that the left shoulder in this portrait has been painted over and blended into the background in a very tight, unnatural looking arc, if you will. If you take a look at that, it just doesn't seem right. If this was in fact done deliberately, it has been gathered, surmised that perhaps this was done to accommodate the new legends surrounding King Richard's the Third's infamy, his new mythical legends of evil, the hunched back Richard III, and that sort of image that was being perhaps strummed up. Hard to say whether it really was a deformity King Richard had or not. We do know that there was some, from records, that there was mention of some mobility issues concerning his shoulder. But as to actual deformities and stuff, I don't know. I'm not quite sure we'll ever really know, but we did find, after all, Richard III's skeleton. It was excavated. They finally found it, and he was given a proper burial. You might want to look into that and see what they suggested concerning his back and his skeleton. I think you can find some of that on YouTube, if I remember correctly, seeing it a few years ago, but that's up to you. You'll have to make those decisions yourself. But this particular painting is problematic. One, Richard III and the Chroniclers. Modern writers on the subject of the princes in the Tower have tended to fall into two categories. Those who believe Richard III guilty of the murder of the princes, but are afraid to commit themselves to any confident conclusions, and those who would like to see Richard more or less canonized. It is time, therefore, for the evidence to be re-evaluated, and the events surrounding the disappearance of the princes in 1483 to be reconstructed with greater confidence, because there does exist a considerable amount of contemporary evidence for a solution to the mystery. It has been said by several writers that both the traditionalist and the revisionist views of Richard III fit the known facts, but this is not the case. There are many blind alleys in this mystery, and many authors who have made the mistake of wandering up them. There also exist a great number of misconceptions about Richard III and the princess, and because the subject still provokes furious debate, one gains the impression that to venture a firm view on the matter is to step into a minefield. However, this book was not written with the intention of fueling the controversy, but because there is a need for the subject to be dealt with from an objective viewpoint based on common sense and sound research. The subject of the princes and the tower cannot be studied without first evaluating the reliability of the few surviving original sources, virtually all we have to rely on. The late 15th century is a poorly documented period of English history. Few contemporary chronicles survive, and some official records still await examination. Thanks to a growing interest in the period, however, much research has been done over the last century and many excellent books have been published. Nevertheless, the second half of the 15th century remains in some respects very much a twilit world to the historian. This book is mainly about the years 1483 to 1485. The period spanning the reigns of Edward V and Richard III. Nearly all the narrative sources for this period have a partisan bias. Most were written in the south of England and reflect anti-northern sentiment, for Richard III was identified very much with northern interest. Few royal letters survive, and of the great collections of letters of the period, the Paston letters, the Seeley letters, and the Stoner letters. Fewer than 10 refer to Richard III's usurpation of the throne in 1483. Much of what we know about the period comes from later sources, because for the years 1483 to 1485 there are very few reliable contemporary narrative sources, and only two major ones. The first of these is Dominic Mancini's account of the events leading up to July 1483. De occupationem regni Angli per Ricardum Tertium, the usurpation of the realm of England by Richard III. Mancini was an Italian monk who lived in France and died after 1494. De Occupationis was his only prose work. Mancini came to England late in 1482 in the suite of the French ambassador. His brief was to report back to the Archbishop of Vienna on English affairs. He remained in London until July 1483, leaving England the week after Richard III's coronation. Mancini's book, which he completed on the 1st December 1483 at Beaugency, was an official report on recent events in England. His stated intention was to put in writing by what machinations Richard III attained the high degree of kingship, and he fulfilled this in the most vivid and objective manner. It is Mancini's objectivity that makes his book an invaluable source. He had no reason to write anything hostile to Richard III, A man of integrity, he confined himself only to the facts and avoided falling into the habit affected by so many contemporary writers, that of using historical facts to illustrate a lesson in morality. Furthermore, he avoided referring to Richard's accession as a usurpation. Occupation is his preferred word. Mancini's credibility as a historian is further reaffirmed by independent corroboration of his account by other sources, notably the Croyland Chronicle and the later accounts of Polydore, Virgil, and Sir Thomas More, none of whom had access to Mancini's book. Indeed, it was lost for centuries. No one knew of its existence until 1934, when it was discovered by Professor C.A. Armstrong in the archives of the Bibliothèque Municipale at Lille, and subsequently published. Mancini was reluctant to name his sources, but his account suggests that he had contacts at court, some of whom were apparently hostile to Richard III. The only source mentioned by name is Dr. John Argentine, physician to Edward V, who could speak Italian. Mancini could also have made use of Italians living in London, in particular Pietro Carmeliano, a court poet to both Edward IV and Henry VII. There are flaws in Mancini's book, of which he himself was aware, stating his reluctance to commit his account to paper as he did not know the names of some of those mentioned, nor the motives. He admitted his account was incomplete in details. He lacked an understanding of English and a knowledge of English geography, and he paid little regard to chronology, although in fairness to him, this was a period when recording dates was not considered of prime importance by historians, nor is there in his book any physical description of Richard III. Perhaps we should assume he never saw him. This and the fact that the later part of the account is less detailed suggest that Mancini was no longer able to make use of some of his former court informants. The major second source for the period 1483 to 1485 is the second continuation of the Croyland Chronicle. The magnificent abbey of Croyland, now spelt Crowland, in Lincolnshire, was at this time the most important and wealthiest religious foundation in the east of England, and its mitred abbot ranked with the bishops. Royal visitors to the abbey in the late 15th century included Henry VI, Edward IV, and Richard III, when he was Duke of Gloucester. Several chronicles detailing the history of England and the abbey were written at Croyland. Those prior to 1117 are spurious, but the three anonymously written continuations spanning the periods 1144 to 1469, 1459 to 1486, and 1485 to 1486 are genuine. So again, those prior to 1117 are spurious, but the three anonymously written continuations spanning the periods 1144 to 1469, 1459 to 1486, and 1485 to 1486 are genuine. The author of the second continuation, 1459 to 1486, states that it was written in the 10 days ending on the 30th of April, 1486. The last events he describes are the marriage of Henry VII and the northern uprising of that spring. His work is without doubt the best source for the period. Where verifiable, it is highly accurate, and its author was a man who could write authoritatively and from personal knowledge of many of the events he describes. It is clear, too, that he withheld information that was politically sensitive. His silence on certain subjects sometimes speaks volumes. Much of what he did write is substantiated by other writers, such as Mancini, Virgil, and Moore, who never read his manuscript. The author of the Croyland Chronicle did not approve of Richard III. As a churchman, he was shocked by Richard's behavior, denouncing him for sensuality, holding an execution on a Sunday, and overspending. However, he declared his intention of writing his history in as unprejudiced a manner as we possibly can, asserting that he was presenting the reader with a truthful recital of the facts without hatred or favor. And he was indeed a surprisingly objective, if ironic, observer for his time. Who was he, this anonymous author, to whom we shall refer merely to as Croyland? He described himself as a doctor of canon law and a member of the Royal Council. We also know from the text that he was a Southerner who resented Northern interlopers in the government. He was a cultivated man who was well acquainted with the workings of council, parliament, convocation, and chancery. Thus, there is every reason to identify him with John Russell, Bishop of Lincoln, 1480 to 1494, Keeper of the Privy Seal, 1474 to 1483, and Lord Chancellor of England under Richard III, 1483 to 1485, an erudite and wise man who earned the praise of Sir Thomas More. Croyland Abbey lay within Russell's diocese, and the third continuation of its chronicle records his month-long visit there in April 1486, when the second continuation was written. The bishop would well have dictated his history to a member of his retinue of 20 persons, or to a monk living in the abbey. Most telling is the fact that the bishop's own involvement in the events described is never referred to. Croyland's manuscript was immediately suppressed when Henry VII, in the interest of dynastic security, ordered the destruction of all copies of the Act of Settlement, known as the Titulus Regius, 1484, which set forth Richard III's title to the throne. The next of this was incorporated in Croyland. Several copies of the manuscript were destroyed. A few survived, being hidden, but Croyland was not used to a historical source until 1619. The earliest surviving copy is that in the Cottonian Library, British Library, MS Cotton Otho, BXIII, which was seriously damaged by fire in 1731. There is a 17th century transcript in the Bodleian Library, Corpus Christi College, MS B 208. The full Latin text was published by W. Fulman in 1684, and the standard translation remains that by H. T. Riley, 1854. Several Tudor sources provide accounts of the period 1483 to 1485. The main problem facing any historian studying Richard III is how much to rely on these Tudor accounts, which are so rich in detail and so hostile to Richard, and which sometimes contradict each other. This problem may be solved by evaluating each on its own merits, taking into account the circumstances in which it was written, and the sources used, if known. We must also consider the difficulties Tudor historians faced in gaining access to sources and information. The earliest Tudor writer of note was John Rous, 1411 to 1491. an artistic Warwickshire chantry priest and antiquarian. He was clearly not an eyewitness to most of the events he describes, and not averse to recording gossip as facts. Roos's writings show with striking clarity how the accession of Henry VII in 1485 affected the recording of contemporary history. Roos was first and foremost a chronicler of the Beauchamp and Neville families, Earls of Warwick, to whom he was devoted. In 1483 to 1485 he compiled the York Roll, an illustrated history in English of these families, which is now in the British Library. Richard III appears in this as the husband of Anne Neville, to whom the roll was dedicated and given, and is referred to by Roos as a mighty prince and especial good lord, a most virtuous prince. Roos made 2 copies of the York Roll. He could not retrieve the first after Richard III's death, but he altered his own Latin copy, now in the College of Arms, London, mutilated it whenever a picture of Richard appeared. His laudatory description of him was deleted, and in its place were just the words, "Infelix Meritus, the unhappy spouse," of Anne Neville. Roos also wrote a history of England dedicated to Henry VII, which was completed in 1490. In it, he portrays Richard III as a deformed monster and tyrant, likened him to the Antichrist. It has been suggested, however, that Roos' hostility towards Richard derived not so much from his desire to win the favor of Henry VII, as from his conviction that Richard had murdered his heroine, Anne Neville. Pietro Carmeliano of Brescia was an Italian cleric who came to England in the reign of Edward IV and became a court poet, later earning the approval of the great humanist scholar Erasmus. In 1483 to 1485, Carmeliano wrote a Life of St. Catherine, Bodleian Library, Oxford, Misc. 501, which he dedicated to Sir Robert Brackenbury, then Constable of the Tower of London. In its introduction, he praised Richard III lavishly, but in September 1486, under Henry VII, he wrote a poem to mark the birth of Henry's son, Arthur, in which he savagely accused Richard of murdering the princes in the Tower, and Henry VI, amongst other crimes. This seems to have won him the king's favor. For that same month, Henry granted him a pension and made him his Latin secretary, chaplain, and lute player. The third writer of note of the early Tudor period was Bernard André, who died after 1527, a blind poet from Toulouse, who became Henry VII's official historian and tutor to his sons after coming to England in 1485. From 1500 to 1502, André worked on a life of Henry VII, which he never completed. This undoubtedly presents the official version of recent history, as approved by the king, but it seems that André also used earlier works which are now lost. He portrays Richard III as an utter villain and Henry VII as God's messenger come to avenge his predecessor's crimes. Erasmus knew André but was unimpressed with his work. The chief foreign source for the Yorkist period is the memoirs of Philippe de Comines, a French politician and diplomat who moved in the highest circles of the courts of France and Burgundy. He compiled his memoirs after his retirement in 1490, and they cover the period 1464 to 1498. After 1480, however, Comines no longer enjoyed the confidence of those who ruled France, although he had met Edward IV and later knew Henry Tudor during his exile. There are obvious flaws in his work, yet he did record the gossip then circulating on the continent and may well have had access to more reliable sources of information for the later period. The so-called London Chronicles provide us with an observant and detailed record of events in the late 15th century. The first is the chronicle known as B.L. Cotton, M.S. Vitellius, A.XVI, written during the early years of Henry VII's reign and published by C.L. Kingsford as Chronicles of London in 1905. Then there is a fragment from the Commonplace Books of a London merchant, which was discovered in the College of Arms in 1980. The published as historical notes of the London Citizen, 1483 to 1488, in 1981. The other London Chronicles were written at least in part by Robert Fabian, d. 1513, a wealthy London clothier and alderman of the City of London. He made a compilation of several London Chronicles, the originals of which are now lost, which is known as the Great Chronicle of London, and is in the Guildhall Library. This is a major source for the period, for all its errors and confused chronology. It is an eyewitness account clearly based on first-hand knowledge of some of the events described and reflecting the public opinion of its day. The section dealing with the period ending 1496 was written before 1501, 1502, and possibly earlier. Although the Great Chronicle is pro-Lancastrian in sympathy, it is unlikely that its author had access to the works of Rous, André, and Carmeliano. Fabian also wrote the Book of the Concordance of Histories, a history of England from the Conquest to his own time, which was printed in 1516 as the New Chronicles of England and France. It was based in part on Fabian's own diaries, but it is not as comprehensive as the Great Chronicle. One controversial source is the Song of the Lady Bessie, a colorful and proven to be mainly fanciful account in verse of the conspiracy that led to Richard III's overthrow. It was probably written before 1504 by Humphrey Brereton, a squire to Lord Stanley, and while it grossly exaggerates the role played by Elizabeth of York in the plot, it contains some apparently authentic details. The chief narrative source, dating from Henry VII's time, is the Anglica Historica of Polydore Virgil. Virgil, a cleric from Urbino, Italy, came to England around 1501 to 1502 and stayed. He was a renowned Renaissance scholar and humanist, and a friend of Erasmus and Thomas More. He quickly attracted the attention of Henry VII, who made use of his talents and rewarded him with benefices. After the accession of Henry VIII, however, he made an enemy of Cardinal Wolsey and fell from favor. He left England in 1551 and died in Italy in 1555. In 1507, Henry VII commissioned Virgil to write an official history of England. Virgil spent 6 years researching this project and wrote the first draft in c. 1512 to 1514. But it took him a further 19 years to complete and revise all the 26 books in the Anglica Historia. The finished work, dedicated to Henry VIII, was published in 1534 in Basel. Virgil's was therefore the first account of Richard III's usurpation to appear in print. In fact, it is the most detailed extant account of his reign. Virgil followed the Renaissance tradition of using history to teach a moral lesson, whereby the reader might benefit from learning about the past. A skillful historian and writer, he used an innovative approach that had a profound influence on later Tudor writers. He could be maddeningly vague at times and selective about what he wrote, yet he was no sycophant. He was critical of Henry VII in places, and raised a storm by his rejection of the time-honored notion that the Arthurian legends were based on fact. Thus he was no more mere propagandist, but an objective writer who drew his own conclusions. Virgil seldom states who his sources were, but Henry VII gave him unrestricted access to official records and personally imparted details of his exile and early years as king. Virgil tells us that other contemporaries also passed on their recollections of previous reigns, some of which they may, of course, have deliberately falsified. He also says he consulted a great number of chronicles and other documents in 1574. It was alleged by John Caius of Cambridge that Virgil had destroyed cartloads of ancient manuscripts so as to ensure that the flaws in his history would not be detected. This may well be the reason why so few sources for Richard III's reign have come down to us. Those that have survived were either hidden or abroad. However, Virgil himself says that he could find very few written sources for the period after 1450. There is no proof that he ever saw the Croyland Chronicle. It had been suppressed long before his time, but the two accounts do corroborate each other to a great extent. Virgil's account of recent times also substantiates in many respects that of Sir Thomas More, see below, but is less detailed. Virgil never saw Mancini's history, yet again the two accounts often agree. Virgil worked under constraints. He was capable of suppressing the truth where it was politic to do so, and was well aware that certain subjects were highly sensitive. He claimed he was presenting a truthful picture, yet he had to be tactful and avoid offending his royal patron and other powerful persons. He may well have been briefed to follow the least said, soonest mended policy adopted by Henry VII himself. In the circumstances, therefore, he wrote, to his credit, a remarkably balanced work. The first and the most controversial biography of Richard III was written by Sir Thomas More, entitled The History of King Richard III. It was written around 1514 to 18 and revised in the late 1520s. More's account is rich in compelling, authentic eyewitnesses' detail, which in itself argues its reliability and shows familiarity with the workings of the royal household in Richard's time. Approximately one-third of it contains eloquent speeches invented by More for his characters but based on authentic source material. This was an accepted practice in an age when history and literature were almost indivisible. More's history has its obvious flaws. Some names and dates are incorrect or missing, and some of its content may be well based on inaccurate sources, or, as More admits, the result of divining upon conjectures. Nevertheless, it has been verified in so many respects, and by so many other sources, such as Mancini and Croyland, who were not known to More, and Virgil, who was, that there is little reason to doubt its overall authenticity. Sir Thomas More was a lawyer, a humanist scholar, and a politician, a man whose reputation for integrity was famous throughout Christendom. He served for a short time as Henry VIII's Lord Chancellor before resigning because his conscience would not allow him to condone Henry's break with Rome. He was executed for his defiance in 1535 and later made a saint by the Roman Catholic Church. More brought to his history of Richard III the benefit of his fine legal mind, his truthfulness, and his intellectual judgment. And there is little doubt that he went to great trouble to find out the truth about the princes in the tower, whose fate was the central theme of his book. Roger Ascham, the great Elizabethan scholar, described the book as a model of historical writing, and there is no evidence that he or his contemporaries ever considered it satirical, which it has been called by at least one modern writer. It was never More's intention to write propaganda for the Tudors, although many have accused him of doing just that. In fact, he had good reason to hate Henry VII in 1504. He had risked a charge of high treason when he opposed the king in Parliament. Henry VII realized that Thomas could not pay the fine his offense merited, so he imprisoned and fined his father, Judge Sir John More. Nor was More any sycophant to Henry VII, or to Henry VIII, who for many years valued his opinion because he knew it was an honest one. More also risked offending his powerful friend, the 3rd Duke of Norfolk, by his brief portrayal of the roles played by the 1st and 2nd Dukes under Richard III. With More, the truth came first. More's work was never intended for publication, but was written purely for private intellectual recreation. Nor was it finished. It may be that More was persuaded by someone influential to abandon it because of things in it that could have proved embarrassing for those of Richard's contemporaries who were still alive, or their descendants, or More may simply have lost interest in the project or lacked the time in which to complete it. More's work has value, therefore, because it was relatively objective. He had no motive for lying. He used a wide variety of sources and obtained first-hand information from those courtiers and others who had been alive in Richard III's time. These people are not named, but we may hazard a guess as to who they were. It has been asserted by numerous writers that More's chief source was Cardinal Morton, Henry VII's Lord Chancellor, who suffered imprisonment and exile under Richard III. More was in Morton's household from the age of 12 to 14, but it is hardly likely that the great cardinal would have favored such a young boy with so many confidences. This is not to say that More did not pick up some information at that time from Morton. He greatly admired him and must have had some personal contact with him. And Morton was the one man who could have known the truth about some of the events of which More writes. More speaks of his deep insight into political worldly drifts. However, the notion that More's information came from Morton was not mooted until 1596, when Sir John Harington suggested in the Metamorphosis of Ajax that Morton might even have been the author of More's book. This theory was later embellished by Richard III's apologist, Sir George Buck, but both Buck and Harington incorrectly assumed that More was an adult when he was in Morton's service. There is no contemporary evidence to suggest that Morton had anything to do with the work, and no serious historian nowadays believes that anyone other than More wrote it. The style of the work alone argues strongly in favor of his authorship. There were many other sources that More could and probably did make use of. His own father, a judge of the King's Bench, had been a keen political observer in Richard's reign. Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, More's singular dear friend, according to More's son-in-law, William Roper, could have told More about the involvement of his family in the events of the time. It is perhaps significant that More makes hardly any reference to these important persons in his book, even though they had been prominent at court, to have done so would have been to compromise both the Duke and More's friendship with him. More may also have obtained information from Dr. John Argentine, Robert Fabian, Polydore Virgil, whose work he knew in manuscript form, Richard Fitzjames, Bishop of London, Edward the Fourth's chaplain and friend, Sir Thomas Lovell, Speaker of the Commons under Henry VII, and a friend of More, Sir John Coote, Richard III's receiver of crown lands in 6 counties and More's predecessor as under treasurer, Sir John Roper, Richard's commissioner of array for Kent and Sir Reginald Bray, and Christopher Urswick, both of whom were involved in the plot to depose Richard and set Henry Tudor on the throne. Urswick was another friend of More's. As a lawyer and under Sheriff of London, More had access to the legal records of Richard III's reign. He also used the Great Chronicle. More wrote both English and Latin versions of his history. A corrupt and altered version was first printed by Richard Grafton in 1543. In Hardyng's Chronicle, it appeared again in Hall's Chronicle in 1548. The full Latin text was printed by More's nephew, William Rastell, in 1557, with a note that it was taken from a holograph manuscript found by Rastell amongst More's papers. The original text is in the College of Arms, London, MS Arundel 43. More's Richard III was widely read and became very popular, and it was the chief inspiration for Shakespeare's Richard III, with which, of course, dramatic liberties were taken. Above all, More gives a credible and consistent portrayal of Richard that can hardly have been based on fiction. Anyone reading his manuscript, which was privately circulated amongst his friends, some of whom had known Richard III, could have spotted any inconsistencies, and More himself had several means of checking his facts. Later Tudor chroniclers, such as Hall and Holinshed, all relied on Virgil and More, but in 1611 the antiquary John Speed discovered a draft of the suppressed act, Titulus Regius, which outlined the grounds on which Richard III had claimed the throne. This discovery shed what appeared to be new light on the fate of the princes. Speed printed the original draft of the act that year, and 6 years later Sir William Cornwallis published the Encomium of Richard III, the first of the revisionist works, which was in effect a defense of Richard against the charge that he had murdered the princess. Cornwall's theme was taken up even more enthusiastically in 1619 by Sir George Buck, who was described by William Camden as a man of distinguished learning. Buck was an old Yorkist family, the great-grandson of John Buck, a member of Richard III's household, who was executed after having supported Richard at Bosworth. The Howard family had later used their influence to prevent his family from losing everything, and more than a century later, Sir George was still grateful to them. He had risen to prominence at the court of Elizabeth I, and became master of the revels to James I, licensing several of Shakespeare's plays in this capacity. Tragically, he went insane in 1621 and died the next year. Buck's The History of King Richard III was written in 1619. It was a vast work, carefully researched from early manuscripts preserved in the Tower of London. Sir Robert Cotton's library, which contained an original copy of the Croyland Chronicle, the College of Arms, and the private collection of Thomas Howard, Earl of Arundel, to whom the work was dedicated. It is also possible that Buck used family information handed down from Richard III's time. Buck's aim in writing his book was to proclaim Richard III's innocence of the crimes laid at his door by earlier writers. He was not entirely impartial. His family had supported Richard, and he felt this needed justification. He claimed that More's biography was too full of errors to be reliable. Many people found Buck's portrayal attractive and credible, and it was at this point that the controversy over Richard III that persists to this day began in earnest. Buck's holograph, MS, Cotton MS Tiberius E.XF.238, corrected and amended on every page, was damaged in the Cottonian fire. Only fragments remain in the British Library. Again, Buck's holograph, MS, Cotton MS Tiberius E.XF.238, corrected and amended on every page, was damaged in the Cottonian fire. Only fragments remain in the British Library. Another version of the first two books of the manuscript is British Library, Egerton MS, 2216 to 2220. But this is a copy. Buck's nephew, another George Buck, printed an abridged and censored version of the work in 1646, the only version available until 1979, when A. N. Kincaid published his splendid edition of the original text, which revealed several convincing details and exposed the deficiencies in the 1646 edition. The last of the original narrative sources was the history of the reign of Henry VII by Sir Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1626, published in 1622. This excellent, erudite work by a lawyer, statesman, and Lord Chancellor was for centuries the standard biography of Henry, well-researched, objective, and advanced for its time. Even today, it stands up well in the face of modern research. Placid as he was, Bacon had access to official records, some no longer extant, and his work has value for this alone. The sources discussed above are so integral to the subject of the princes that, as will be seen in the following chapters, they are indeed part of the plot. All these writers have in their various ways influenced the controversy about the princes, and so we need to know about them and their loyalties and prejudices before we can consider what weight to give to their evidence. This is a crucial factor because in the evidence lie the vital clues to the fate of the princes.